Today I'm making a pair of walnut furniture legs because my daughter wants a balance beam because she loves gymnastics. Design is an iterative process. I'm always building off the last thing, analyzing, erasing, redoing, refining, until I get the best shape I can. These legs follow that design process. I started out with a scrap piece of plywood to use as a template. I marked out some basic measurements, outlining the rough size I wanted the legs to be. Then went to work sketching out the curves, refining them until I found a shape that I liked. I know every woodworking magazine out there has a tips section showing someone tracing the outline of a paint can as an easy way of creating a curve. But if I did it the easy way, my curves would look just like everyone else's curves. For that reason, when I design, I try to stay away from the usual tips and mathematical formulas such as the golden ratio. I try to trust my design eye and feel I have trained it over the years to recognize good proportion and shapes. So if it looks good to me, I hope it will look good to others. Once I was satisfied with the design of the leg, I cut it free and headed over to the bandsaw to rough out the shape. Sorry this clip is so blurry. I set the camera on the edge of the bandsaw fence and so it vibrated and just made bad video. I cut it to the right height at the table saw, then drew in the lower curve and cut it out at the bandsaw. When I was cutting the leg out at the bandsaw, I made sure I left the line so I could smooth out the saw marks and refine the shape with the spindle sander. Now time to mill the stock to build the legs out of. I used the template I had made as a quick reference to set the width of the table saw and rip the parts to their final width. I used the template to trace out the shape of the leg on the stock, flipped it over, lined up my center mark, and traced out the other side. By flipping it, it ensures the piece will be symmetrical. It's a lot easier to cut the mortises for the floating tenons when the stock is still square. Once I cut the mortises, I headed to the bandsaw to cut out the legs. The pencil line was a little hard to see against the dark walnut, so I set up a portable light on the saw. This worked out pretty well. I cut the legs about 1/16 of an inch oversize, so I could clean up the saw marks and make a perfect match to the template with a router bit at the router table. I used a little double stick tape to hold the pieces together, and the blue tape is to make it a little easier to break apart after routing. I took multiple passes, taking small bites with each pass as I routed through the curves. If not careful, the end grain can catch and ruin the workpiece. I also routed with the flow of the grain or downhill as I routed the end grain. This also greatly reduces the possibility of a catch. Then when it was time to route the other side, I flipped the workpiece over and not the template. This way I was always routing downhill, reducing the chance of a catch. Then I used a 3/4 inch radius roundover bit to give the leg a nice gentle sculpted shape. Since I'm rounding over all 4 sides, on 2 of the sides I had no choice but to route uphill into the grain on the curves. To prevent the wood from catching and blowing out a chunk, I took many shallow passes until I had created a full roundover. Now that the legs are done except for a little sanding, I moved on to making the beam. I just used standard construction lumber. I jointed a few 2x8s flat, then ran them through the planer to make the other side parallel. I ripped the boards to their final width with the table saw, spread some glue, and clamped them up. A couple of the boards were not flush, so after the glue dried I ran them across the joiner to re-establish a flat edge and sent them through the planer to flush everything up. After everything was squared back up, I cut the mortises for the floating tenons to attach the legs. The beam is going to be wrapped and swayed and attached with staples from the underside. To be sure no little fingers get caught on a wayward staple, I am routing out a recess for the staples to go. Multiple passes with the router left the end of the recess a little jagged, so I just used a chisel to clean up the ends. I wanted the legs to fit inside the recess, so I used the dado blade at the table saw to cut a shoulder on the top, creating a little tenon. So no one cracks their head open on the sharp corner of the beam, I used a roundover bit to ease the edges over. My wife picked out a nice red suede. I rolled it out and cut it a little wider than I needed so I'd have plenty of material to work with. Then I started wrapping the beam. I started in the middle, stapling one side, then stretching and stapling the other side. I worked my way towards the ends. The corners were a little bit difficult, but I just kept working at it, folding and stapling, then cutting off some of the excess, and then folding and stapling in some more, and I just worked at it. It took a little while, but I finally ended up with a neatly folded corner. Then I used a little epoxy to glue on the legs. As a final step to conceal the staples, I milled a piece of wood to fit inside the channel I had created earlier and secured it with a few screws. Now I realize having walnut legs on a balance beam that my daughter will grow out of in no time may be a little bit extravagant, but that's one of the great things about being a maker. You can make extravagant things just for fun. Please join me on Patreon if you want to support more extravagant builds.